The telegram arrived at 8:47 in the morning, and it said nothing at all. That was the problem. For 31 minutes, the military communications center in Tokyo had been sending urgent messages to Hiroshima. Routine confirmations. Status updates. Requests for morning reports from the Second Army headquarters. Every single message vanished into silence. The operators checked their equipment 3 times. They switched frequencies. They contacted relay stations in Kure and Okayama. Nothing was wrong with the system. Something was wrong with Hiroshima. Lieutenant Masao Yoshida stared at his instruments and felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He had worked this station for 2 years. He had handled communications during the Tokyo firebombings that killed over 80,000 people in a single night. He had relayed death counts from Okinawa as the Americans ground their way through Japanese defenses. But he had never experienced anything like this. Cities did not simply stop talking. 3 floors above him, General Yoshijiro Yumizu was already dismissing the reports. The Army Chief of Staff had survived 4 decades of military service by refusing to panic. Telegraph lines broke during air raids. Relay stations failed. These things happened in war. He ordered a reconnaissance aircraft to investigate and returned to studying maps of the expected American invasion routes along the Kyushu coastline. The real battle, he believed, was still months away, but Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo could not stop thinking about a conversation he had 3 days earlier. A Swedish diplomat had passed along rumors from neutral sources in Europe. The Americans had tested something new in a desert somewhere. Something that created light brighter than the sun and left glass fused into the sand. Togo had filed the information away as speculation. Now he wished he had paid closer attention. By noon, scattered reports began filtering in from the edges of the disaster. A train conductor 60 kilometers from Hiroshima described a flash so bright it blinded passengers facing the windows. A fisherman in the inland sea spoke of a mushroom-shaped cloud rising higher than any storm he had ever witnessed. A military pilot flying patrol duty reported that where Hiroshima should have been, there was only smoke and fire spreading in a perfect circle. Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki listened to these reports in his private office. He was 77 years old. He had survived an assassination attempt during the military uprising of 1936, taking 4 bullets that nearly killed him. He had served the emperor for half a century. He had watched Japan transform from a feudal nation into an industrial power, and he had watched that power crumble under American bombs. Nothing surprised him anymore. But this was different. This felt like the end of something. War Minister Korechika Anami paced the conference room like a caged animal. He was a soldier's soldier, built from discipline and duty. He had commanded troops in China. He had trained pilots for kamikaze missions, sending young men to certain death with prayers for their glorious sacrifice. He believed in the spirit of Japan with an intensity that bordered on religious faith. And he refused to accept that any single weapon could change the fundamental nature of war. The Americans are trying to frighten us, he declared. Whatever happened at Hiroshima, we will rebuild. We will fight on. The invasion is coming, and we will make them pay for every meter of Japanese soil in blood. Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yanai said nothing. He had opposed the war from the beginning. He knew the numbers. Japan had lost most of its fleet at Leyte Gulf. Okinawa had cost them over 100,000 soldiers. American submarines had strangled their supply lines until factories ran without steel and vehicles ran without fuel. The war was already lost. This new weapon was simply the final confirmation. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the reconnaissance pilot returned to Tokyo. His name was Lieutenant Kiyoshi Abe, and his hands shook so badly that officers had to help him from the cockpit. They brought him to headquarters and sat him before the Supreme War Council. He tried to describe what he had seen. He used words like flattened and erased and gone. He said the entire city center had been replaced by a crater. He said survivors were wandering through rubble with their skin hanging from their bodies like torn cloth. He said he could see the shadow of a bridge burned permanently into stone. The room fell silent. General Anami stared at the table. Admiral Toyota closed his eyes. Foreign Minister Togo felt something breaking inside his chest, and in the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito received the first reports from his closest advisors. He sat perfectly still, his face revealing nothing. But his hands trembled slightly as he set down the papers. Somewhere in the ruins of Hiroshima, fires still burned. Survivors searched for families they would never find. And in Tokyo, the men who would decide Japan's fate began to understand that the world had changed forever. The question now was whether anyone would survive long enough to see what came next. Dr. Yoshio Nishina had dreamed about this moment for 5 years, and in every dream, it was Japan that succeeded first. 2 military officers pulled him from his laboratory at the Institute of Physical and Chemical Research before dawn on August 7. They drove through Tokyo's darkened streets without explanation, past neighborhoods still scarred from the March firebombings, past checkpoints manned by exhausted soldiers. Nishina was Japan's foremost nuclear physicist. He had studied under Niels Bohr in Copenhagen. He had led his country's own atomic research program, struggling with insufficient uranium and dwindling resources while American scientists raced toward the same goal with unlimited funding. They showed him the aerial photographs in a basement room beneath military headquarters. He studied them for 7 minutes without speaking. The perfect circle of destruction. The way buildings at the center had not collapsed but simply ceased to exist. The thermal shadows burned into surviving walls where human beings had stood before the flash vaporized them. Uranium or plutonium, he finally said. His voice was barely a whisper. They have done what we could not do. They have built the bomb. The Supreme War Council met in emergency session that morning. 6 men who held the fate of 70 million Japanese citizens in their hands sat around a polished table and tried to comprehend the incomprehensible. General Anami argued for continued resistance. Admiral Toyota supported him. Army Chief Yamizu insisted that one city meant nothing against the might of Japan's remaining 4 million soldiers, but Foreign Minister Togo had received diplomatic cables from Switzerland. The Americans had issued a public statement. They called it an atomic bomb. They promised more would follow unless Japan surrendered unconditionally. They were already broadcasting warnings to the Japanese people through radio transmissions that penetrated the government censorship. We cannot fight physics, Togo said quietly. We cannot defeat science with spirit. If they can destroy a city with a single bomb, they can destroy every city. Tokyo. Osaka. Kyoto. Everything. Prime Minister Suzuki listened to both sides without interruption. He was old enough to remember when Japan had shocked the world by defeating Russia in 1905. He understood national pride. He also understood mathematics. 1 bomb. 200,000 people dead or dying. American factories producing more bombs every month. The equation was simple and terrible. Emperor Hirohito summoned Lord Privy Seal Koichi Kido to the palace that evening. The emperor rarely involved himself directly in policy discussions. His role was ceremonial, spiritual, a living symbol of Japan's unbroken imperial line stretching back 2,600 years. But Kido had known him since childhood. He could read the concern behind the careful mask. The suffering, Hirohito said. The photographs show such suffering. Kido had seen the same photographs. Survivors with melted faces. Children searching for parents who had become ash. Hospitals overwhelmed with patients whose wounds defied medical understanding. The burns were different from fire burns. They came from inside the body as well as outside. Radiation, the scientists called it. An invisible poison that continued killing long after the blast itself had ended. The military believes we can endure, Kido offered carefully. The military believed we would win at Midway. At Leyte. At Okinawa. The emperor's voice remained calm, but something flickered in his eyes. How many must die before endurance becomes extinction? That night, new intelligence reached Tokyo. Soviet troops were massing along the Manchurian border. Stalin had promised to remain neutral until the war in Europe ended. Now, 3 months after Germany's surrender, he was preparing to break that promise. The Guangdong Army in Manchuria was a shadow of its former strength, most of its best units transferred to defend the home islands. If the Soviets attacked, nothing would stop them. General Anami received this news in his office at midnight. He sat alone in the darkness for a long time. He had dedicated his life to the emperor and the empire. He had sent thousands of young men to die believing their sacrifice would bring victory. Now the walls were closing in from every direction. Americans from the east. Soviets from the west. And somewhere above, perhaps already loading into another bomber, another bomb waited to fall. He took out paper and ink. He began writing a letter to his wife. He told her he loved her. He told her he was proud of their children. He did not tell her that he was beginning to wonder if everything he believed had been a beautiful lie. Outside, the first light of August 8 began to color the sky. In Nagasaki, 400 kilometers to the southwest, people woke to an ordinary morning. They had no way of knowing that in 36 hours, their city would join Hiroshima in history's darkest chapter. The clock was ticking. And no one could stop it. The Soviet ambassador arrived at the foreign ministry at exactly 5 p.m. on August 8, and Shigenori Togo knew what he would say before he opened his mouth. Ambassador Yakov Malik's face was carved from diplomatic stone. He delivered his message in formal Russian while a translator converted each sentence into Japanese. The Soviet Union had declared war on Japan. Soviet armies were already crossing the Manchurian border at multiple points. The neutrality pact that had protected Japan's northern flank for 4 years had become worthless paper. Togo thanked the ambassador with perfect courtesy and watched him leave. Then he sat down heavily in his chair and stared at the wall. 2 fronts now. American bombs from the sky. Soviet tanks from the earth. And somewhere in between, 70 million Japanese people waiting to learn whether they would live or die. The news reached the Supreme War Council within the hour. General Anami received it like a physical blow. The Guangdong Army had once been Japan's finest fighting force, 700,000 soldiers who had conquered Manchuria and threatened to push into Siberia itself. Now it was a hollow shell. Its best divisions had been stripped away to defend the home islands. The units that remained were filled with old men and young boys, equipped with outdated weapons and insufficient ammunition. Against Stalin's battle-hardened veterans fresh from destroying the Wehrmacht, they would not last a month, but Anami refused to break. "We still have the homeland," he insisted. "We still have the mountains and the beaches. Let the Americans come. Let the Soviets come. We will drown them in Japanese blood." At 11:02 on the morning of August 9, a B-29 bomber named Boxcar released a plutonium bomb over Nagasaki. The original target had been Kakura, but cloud cover forced the pilot to divert to his secondary objective. In that random moment of weather, 40,000 people's fate was sealed. The bomb detonated at an altitude of 500 meters. The explosion generated temperatures exceeding 4,000 degrees. A woman hanging laundry in her garden became a shadow burned into concrete. A streetcar full of passengers melted into the steel rails. The Urakami Cathedral, the largest Christian church in East Asia, collapsed into rubble, killing hundreds of worshippers who had gathered for morning mass. News of the second bomb reached Tokyo by early afternoon. Prime Minister Suzuki called an emergency session of the Supreme War Council. The same 6 men who had argued for 3 days now faced an even more terrible reality. One bomb might have been a fluke, a desperate gamble using America's only weapon. 2 bombs proved they could produce more. The question was no longer whether Japan could win. The question was whether Japan would survive. The council split exactly down the middle. Anami, Toyota, and Yamizu demanded continued resistance. They proposed conditions for surrender. Japan would disarm itself rather than submit to occupation. War criminals would be tried by Japanese courts. The emperor would retain his throne. Togo, Yanai, and Suzuki argued for accepting the Potsdam Declaration with only one condition: preserving the imperial institution. They knew the Americans would never accept the military's terms. Every day of delay meant more bombs, more Soviet advances, more Japanese deaths. The debate raged for hours. Voices rose in anger. Accusations of cowardice and foolishness flew across the table. Outside, the sun set over Tokyo, painting the sky in shades of red that reminded everyone of fire. At 10 o'clock that night, Prime Minister Suzuki made an unprecedented decision. He requested an imperial conference. He would ask Emperor Hirohito himself to break the deadlock. They gathered in the underground bomb shelter beneath the palace at midnight. The emperor sat on a simple chair, wearing his military uniform. His advisors knelt before him on the bare concrete floor. The air was thick with humidity and desperation. Each faction presented its case. Enemy spoke of honor and duty and the samurai spirit that had sustained Japan for centuries. Togo spoke of survival and hope and the future generations who deserved a chance to rebuild. Then Suzuki turned to the emperor. Your Majesty, we cannot reach consensus. We humbly request your decision. Hirohito sat in silence for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Tears streamed down his face. I have given serious thought to the situation, he said. Continuing the war can only mean destruction for the nation. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. He paused. His hands trembled. The time has come to bear the unbearable. I swallow my tears and give my sanction to the proposal to accept the Allied proclamation. The emperor had spoken. The war was over, but in the barracks and ministries of Tokyo, young officers were already plotting to ensure it would not end without one final act of defiance. Major Kenji Hatanaka believed he was saving Japan. That belief would kill him before sunrise. The young army officer moved through the darkness of the imperial palace grounds on the night of August 14th with a pistol at his hip and treason in his heart. Behind him followed a small group of soldiers who shared his conviction that surrender was betrayal. They called their plan the Kyujo incident. Its goal was simple: seize the palace, destroy the emperor's surrender recording before it could be broadcast, and rally the army for one final battle. Earlier that evening, Emperor Hirohito had recorded his announcement in a small studio within the palace. His voice, thin and formal in the ancient court dialect, declared Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. The recording was contained on 2 phonograph discs, each one precious beyond measure. If the rebels found them, months of diplomatic maneuvering would collapse into chaos. Chamberlain Yoshihiro Tokugawa understood the danger. He had supervised the recording session personally. Now he carried the discs through the palace corridors, searching for a hiding place the rebels would never suspect. He finally concealed them in a pile of documents belonging to a court lady's office. It was such an ordinary place that it became invisible. Hatanaka's men reached the palace at midnight. They had forged orders bearing the seal of the Eastern Army commander. Guards, confused and conflicted, let them pass. The rebels spread through the grounds, searching rooms, interrogating servants, demanding to know where the recording was hidden. General Shizuchi Tanaka, commander of the Eastern Army, learned of the coup attempt within hours. He drove to the palace immediately. Tanaka was a loyalist to his core. He had no sympathy for officers who would defy the emperor's direct command. He confronted Hatanaka personally in the palace courtyard. The emperor has decided, Tanaka said. You will stand down or you will be destroyed. Hatanaka pleaded. He argued. He insisted that history would vindicate his actions. But the regular troops remained loyal. One by one, the rebel soldiers lowered their weapons. By 4 a.m, the coup had collapsed. In his private quarters, War Minister Anami made his final preparations. He had refused to support the rebellion. He had also refused to stop it. Now, as dawn approached, he put on his formal white uniform and knelt on the tatami floor of his study. His brother-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Saburo Hayashi, sat beside him as witness. Anami wrote one last poem. Having received great favors from the emperor, I have nothing to say in the hour of my death. Then he drew his ceremonial sword and performed seppuku in the traditional manner. He did not cry out. He did not hesitate. He died believing he had preserved his honor even as everything else crumbled. At noon on August 15, radios across Japan crackled to life. Families gathered in living rooms. Factory workers stopped their machines. Soldiers stood at attention in barracks from Hokkaido to Okinawa. What followed was unprecedented in Japanese history. The emperor's voice emerged from speakers for the first time ever. Most ordinary citizens had never heard him speak. Many struggled to understand the formal court language. But the meaning became clear. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. In Tokyo, people fell to their knees and wept. Some cried from relief. Others cried from shame. Soldiers who had prepared to die defending the beaches learned they would live. Mothers who had prayed for sons on distant islands allowed themselves to hope those sons might come home. Major Hatanaka shot himself on the palace grounds as soldiers closed in. His final act was distributing leaflets explaining his motives. He believed future generations would understand. History has judged differently. Foreign Minister Togo stood at his office window and watched the city absorb the news. 300,000 people had died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Millions more had died across the Pacific over 4 years of war. Now it was finished. Japan would be occupied, transformed, and eventually reborn. But first, it had to survive. Prime Minister Suzuki submitted his resignation that afternoon. He had guided his nation through its darkest hour. Now younger men would guide it toward the light. He retired to his country home and never participated in public life again. In the ruins of Hiroshima, survivors began the long work of rebuilding. They cleared rubble with bare hands. They buried the dead in mass graves. They planted trees in ground that scientists said would be poisoned for decades. Somehow, life continued, and in the imperial palace, Hirohito sat alone with his thoughts. He had broken with tradition to save his people. He had spoken publicly to preserve his nation. Whether his decision was wisdom or weakness, courage or cowardice, only time would tell. Outside, the August sun set over a Japan that no longer existed. Tomorrow, a new Japan would begin to take its place. The war was over. The future was uncertain. But for the first time in years, there was peace, and in that peace, there was hope.